The child's shoes made no sound on the polished marble floor, yet every head in the restaurant turned as if pulled by invisible wire. She couldn't have been more than 7, her school uniform wrinkled and stained with something that might have been tears or rain, her small fists clutching a folded piece of paper so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Niran Calvet sat alone at his usual corner table, positioned where he could see both entrances and the stretch of Cape Fear River beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The amber glow from vintage Edison bulbs cast shadows across his angular features, highlighting the scar that traced his left eyebrow. The girl moved through the restaurant like a ghost, navigating a world that had already forgotten her. She passed tables where men in $1,000 suits discussed shipping contracts and real estate deals, where women draped in silk laughed at jokes that weren't funny. His bodyguard stepped forward from his position near the kitchen entrance, one hand moving instinctively toward his jacket. Niran raised 2 fingers without looking away from the approaching child, and the man froze mid-stride. The restaurant manager appeared from nowhere, apologetic smile already forming, hands reaching to intercept this violation of their exclusive atmosphere. Niran's gaze shifted to him for precisely 1 second, and the man retreated as if he'd touched a live wire, suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. Ilya stopped 3 feet from his table, maintaining the careful distance of someone who'd learned that adults could be dangerous. Her breathing came shallow and quick, her chest rising and falling beneath the school crest embroidered on her worn blazer. The paper in her hands trembled like a captured bird. "You can me take to school?" Her voice barely rose above a whisper, each word fighting past the fear lodged in her throat. The grammatical error spoke of panic overriding thought, of desperation stripping away careful speech learned in classrooms that had failed to protect her. Niran set down his knife with deliberate care, the soft click of silver against porcelain impossibly loud in the suffocating silence. He studied her face the way he studied contracts before signing them, searching for deception, and finding only raw terror. Behind her eyes lived something he recognized from mirrors in his own youth. Why? The single word carried no warmth, but no threat either, just the flat curiosity of a man accustomed to understanding motivations before acting. He leaned back slightly, giving her space to breathe, to choose whether to continue or flee. Ilya's hands shook harder as she unfolded the paper, smoothing it against her chest before extending it toward him. The movement exposed a bracelet of bruises circling her thin wrist, purple and yellow marks that formed the unmistakable pattern of adult fingers. She didn't seem to notice his attention shift to them. "They push me every day. They say mean things and nobody stops them." The words tumbled out faster now, like water breaching a dam. "And there's a man in a black car who follows me home and he knows where I live." Niran took the paper from her trembling fingers, his movements slow and measured. The page contained a child's drawing in fading crayon, a stick figure girl surrounded by larger figures with angry scribbled faces, and off to the side, a black rectangle with circles for wheels. In the corner, written in wobbly letters, was an address he recognized from the east side. "I told my teacher and she said I'm being dramatic. I told the principal and he said kids need to learn to solve their own problems." Ilya's voice cracked, tears spilling over despite her obvious effort to appear brave. "My mom called the police and they said mean words aren't a crime." The restaurant had become a tableau of frozen voyeurs, every person present aware they were witnessing something that would be discussed in whispers for weeks. Niran folded the drawing carefully, creasing it along lines that had already been folded and refolded countless times, evidence of a child seeking courage in preparation. Why me? He asked the question that mattered, the one that separated random desperation from calculated choice. His reputation wasn't secret. Everyone in Wilmington knew his name and what it meant. What happened to people who earned his attention for the wrong reasons? Elia wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of dirt across her cheek. "Because everyone is scared of you. And I thought maybe if they're scared of you, they'll be scared to hurt me." The logic was devastatingly simple. The reasoning of a child who'd learned that fear was the only currency that mattered. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Riverside Elementary, casting long shadows across the playground, where Elia had learned to make herself invisible. 3 weeks earlier, the nightmare had begun with a boy twice her size shoving her into the brick wall during recess, laughing as her lunchbox scattered across the asphalt. She'd picked up her sandwich from the dirt, brushed it off, and said nothing. Silence had become her shield, though it protected nothing. The attacks grew bolder, textbooks knocked from her desk, her backpack thrown into the girls' bathroom toilet, whispered threats about what would happen if she told. The teachers walked past with eyes that saw everything and acknowledged nothing. Mrs. Patterson had actually smiled when Aaliyah approached her desk with a split lip, suggesting that children need to be more careful during play. The word play had tasted like blood in Aaliyah's mouth. Her classmates had learned the social mathematics quickly. Association with Aaliyah meant becoming a target, so the few friends she'd had evaporated like morning mist. By the second week, she ate lunch alone in the library, hiding between shelves of books about children who had adventures and happy endings. The black car appeared on a Tuesday. Aaliyah had noticed it idling across from the school gates, engine running, windows tinted so dark she couldn't see inside. At first, she'd thought nothing of it. Parents waited in cars all the time, though usually not in vehicles that looked like they belonged in movies about criminals. The next day, the car was there again, in the same spot, and the next. By Friday, when she walked past it to head home, the passenger window rolled down just enough for a voice to reach her. "I know which apartment is yours, the one with the broken blind." Aaliyah had run the remaining 4 blocks home, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She'd burst through the apartment door to find her mother already in scrubs, preparing for another night shift at the hospital. Syrian's exhausted smile had faltered when she saw her daughter's face. "Baby, what happened?" Siren had knelt immediately, hands gentle on Aaliyah's shoulders, searching for injuries with eyes trained to spot trauma. But some wounds didn't show on the surface, didn't bleed in ways that could be bandaged or treated with antiseptic. Aaliyah told her everything, about the bullying that had become daily ritual, about the teachers who suggested she try harder to fit in, about the car and the voice, and the knowledge of where they lived. She watched her mother's face shift from concern to rage to helpless fear. Serene had called the school that night, her voice steady despite shaking hands. The vice principal had listened with practiced patience, before explaining that without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, the school couldn't take action. "Children exaggerate," she'd said. "They have active imaginations." Perhaps Aaliyah was struggling with the transition to second grade. The police had been worse. The officer who took Seren's report had leaned back in his chair, pen tapping against his notepad. "Ma'am, someone sitting in a car near a school isn't illegal. And kids these days, they watch too much TV. They see danger everywhere." He'd suggested family counseling. That night, Seren had held Aaliyah until she fell asleep, then sat at their small kitchen table, staring at bills she couldn't pay and a system that wouldn't help. She worked doubles to keep them fed, came home to an empty apartment because childcare cost more than she earned, and now learned that her daughter's fear counted for nothing against bureaucracy. The bruises came next. Aaliyah fell down the stairs at school, or so the story went. Then she walked into a door. Then she tripped during gym class. Each incident carefully positioned in the gray area between obvious abuse and plausible accident, each one designed to terrorize while maintaining deniability. Seren photographed every mark, documented every incident, called every authority she could find. The responses varied in wording, but carried the same message: prove it, bring witnesses, show us evidence that meets our threshold. Your daughter's word against theirs isn't enough. The black car continued its vigil. Sometimes it was there in the morning, sometimes only after school. Once, Aaliyah saw it parked on her street at midnight, visible from her bedroom window. She'd stopped sleeping through the night, startling awake at every sound, certain the voice would make good on its promise. Niran sat alone in his office above the restaurant long after Aaliyah had left. The child's drawing spread flat on his desk beneath the cone of light from his banker's lamp. He'd sent her home with his driver, watched from the window as the car disappeared into Wilmington's evening traffic, carrying its precious cargo to an address on the east side. The city below sparkled with deceptive beauty, lights reflecting off the Cape Fear River like scattered diamonds. He'd built his empire in these streets, carved his territory from the bones of men who'd underestimated him. Power here was measured in loyalty, fear, and the careful application of violence when words failed. Yet no amount of power had prepared him for the sight of a 7-year-old child asking him to be her shield. He'd killed men for lesser offenses than the ones inflicted on Aaliyah. He'd destroyed businesses, ended careers, sent messages written in consequences that people understood. But this required something different, something he wasn't certain he possessed. His lieutenant, Cole Brennan, sat across from him in patient silence. The man had been with Niran for a decade, had seen him navigate gang wars and federal investigations without breaking composure. Now he watched his boss stare at a child's crayon drawing, as if it held answers to questions nobody had asked yet. The school is Riverside Elementary. The principal is Dennis Crawford, 20 years in the position. Clean record, active in the Chamber of Commerce. Cole's voice carried the flat professionalism of a man reading intelligence reports. The car is likely a 2019 Dodge Charger, black tinted windows. 3 similar vehicles registered to known associates of the West Side crew. Naran's fingers drummed once against the desk, the only external sign of the calculation happening behind his eyes. The West Side crew dealt in drugs and extortion, operated with the vicious stupidity of men who mistook cruelty for strength. They'd been expanding territory, pushing into neighborhoods previously considered neutral ground. The mother is Seren Halden, night shift nurse at Cape Fear Valley. Single parent, no criminal record, no outstanding debts. Lives in a rent-controlled building on 5th Street. Cole paused, consulting notes he'd compiled in the hour since Elia's visit. She's made 4 police reports in 3 weeks. None resulted in action. The detail about the police reports landed like a stone in still water. Naran understood bureaucratic indifference, had benefited from it countless times when authorities chose to look elsewhere while he conducted business. But the same machinery that ignored his activities also ignored children begging for help. And that equation revealed something rotten in the foundation. The boy leading the bullying is Travis Sheridan, 8 years old, son of Philip Sheridan, who owns 3 car dealerships and sits on the school board. Cole's tone remained neutral, but his eyes flickered with something sharper. The other children involved come from similar backgrounds: money, connections, parents who donate to the right causes. Naran absorbed this, fitting pieces into patterns he recognized. The world ran on protection, those who had it and those who didn't. Aaliyah had none, which made her invisible to people who only saw value measured in influence. She'd become acceptable collateral damage in a system designed to preserve comfort for those already comfortable. And the car following her? The question carried weight beyond its words, because Naran already knew what the answer would reveal about how far this went beyond schoolyard cruelty. Cole's jaw tightened. Best guess is recruitment or intimidation. The West Side crew has been targeting single mothers in that neighborhood, pushing protection rackets. If the mother doesn't pay, they go after the kids, make them scared enough that the parents comply. He set down his tablet. It's effective because nobody reports it. Who's going to believe a child over respectable businessmen? The silence that followed carried a quality of decision crystallizing into action. Naran stood, moving to the window where he could see his city spread below him like a kingdom built on compromises. He'd told himself for years that his business, however brutal, had rules. You didn't hurt children. You didn't prey on the defenseless. You kept the violence between those who chose this life. But the truth staring back at him from the river's reflection was uglier. His rules meant nothing to people like Travis Sheridan's father or the West Side crew. They operated in spaces he'd ignored, causing harm he'd considered beneath his notice. Aaliyah's fear existed because men like him had carved the world into territories and decided some streets didn't matter enough to protect. She asked me to walk her to school. Naran spoke quietly, almost to himself. A 7-year-old child decided that the most dangerous man she could find was safer than the people supposed to protect her. What does that say about us? Cole stood, recognizing the shift in his boss's posture that meant orders would follow. What do you want me to do? The question opened doors to possibilities both men understood, without needing to articulate them. Naran turned from the window, his face settling into the expression that made grown men reconsider their life choices. But beneath the calculated intimidation lived something newer, something that felt uncomfortably like purpose awakening after a long sleep. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I'm taking her to school. Dawn broke over Wilmington with the kind of golden light that made the city look innocent, as if the darkness that thrived in its corners couldn't survive the clean wash of morning. Naran's car moved through empty streets, while most of the world still slept. The engine's purr the only sound besides gulls crying over the river. He'd chosen the sedan instead of the SUV his security preferred, something that looked expensive but not ostentatious. The goal wasn't to arrive like an invading army, but to deliver a message written in presence rather than spectacle. Cole sat in the passenger seat, silent and alert, his eyes scanning every intersection they passed. Aaliyah's apartment building rose from a block of similar structures, all wearing the same expression of dignity, fighting a losing battle against time and neglect. The brick facade had once been red, but had faded to the color of dried roses. Window air conditioners jutted from random openings like metal tumors. Naran had been to worse places, had conducted business in basements and warehouses where rats outnumbered people. But something about this building's tired respectability hit differently, families trying to maintain normalcy in spaces that demanded constant compromise. Saren Halden worked night shifts to afford this, and her daughter still wasn't safe. The apartment door opened before he could knock. Saren stood there in wrinkled scrubs, her face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd worked 12 hours, then stayed awake worrying. She'd clearly been watching from the window, waiting for the car she both hoped and feared would come. Mr. Calvert. Her voice held steady despite the tremor in her hands. I don't know what my daughter asked you, but I can't. We don't have money to pay you for whatever this is. Pride and panic warred in her expression. The dignity of someone drowning, but still refusing to grab at anything that might pull them under differently. Niran met her eyes with the directness that made most people look away. She asked me to walk her to school because she's terrified and nobody else would help. I'm not here for money. The words came out harder than he'd intended. Frustration bleeding through at a system that taught women like Saren that safety always came with a price tag. Elia appeared behind her mother, already dressed in her uniform, backpack clutched against her chest like armor. She'd clearly been ready for an hour, afraid that being late might make him change his mind. Her eyes found his face with desperate hope that hurt something in his chest he'd thought long dead. The drive to Riverside Elementary took 12 minutes. Elia sat in the back seat, perfectly still, her reflection in the rearview mirror showing a child who'd learned that drawing attention meant inviting pain. Saren had wanted to come, but her shift supervisor had already denied her time-off request. The system failed her even in this. Morning traffic thickened as they approached the school, parents in minivans and luxury sedans forming the daily parade of drop-offs. Niran watched them through the windshield, these people who lived in the same city but inhabited completely different worlds. Their children complained about homework and weekend plans while Elia counted the days she survived. The school emerged from behind oak trees that had probably stood there for a century, their branches creating a canopy over brick buildings designed to look welcoming. Everything about Riverside Elementary screamed investment and care. The manicured lawns, the fresh paint, the playground equipment that still had shine on it. Money flowed through this place, just not toward protecting children who didn't come from the right families. Niran parked in the circular drive where buses usually stopped, ignoring the designated parent drop-off area completely. The location forced everyone to notice, made his car the centerpiece of the morning routine. Cole stepped out first, a practiced movement that positioned his body between the vehicle and potential threats neither man actually expected. Then Niran emerged, and the morning shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Parents froze with car doors half open. A crossing guard actually dropped her stop sign, the metal clattering against asphalt with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. He opened Aaliyah's door with the same care he'd use handling Crystal. She climbed out slowly, her small hand finding his with a trust that terrified him more than any gun he'd ever faced. The weight of her fingers against his palm carried the responsibility of every choice he'd make from this moment forward. They walked toward the entrance together, Niran matching his stride to Elia's smaller steps. The crowd parted without anyone consciously deciding to move, bodies responding to instincts older than thought. Parents pulled their children closer, not in protection from him, but in recognition that proximity to this moment carried consequences they couldn't predict. Travis Sheridan stood near the playground fence with his usual pack of followers, mid-sentence in some story that probably involved someone else's humiliation. He saw Elia first, his face already forming the cruel smile he'd perfected over weeks of unchallenged torment. Then his eyes traveled up to the man beside her, and the smile crumbled like sandcastles before incoming tide. The boy actually stepped backward, stumbling over his own feet in his haste to create distance. His friends scattered like startled birds, their collective bravery evaporating the instant they understood that their victim had acquired protection of a caliber they'd never imagined. One of them dropped his action figure, leaving it abandoned in the grass. Niran didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge their existence beyond the peripheral awareness he'd cultivated through years of reading rooms for threats. But his presence spoke volumes that needed no words. The cut of his suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. The way he moved with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his right to occupy space. The scar that suggested violence survived rather than avoided. A teacher monitoring the entrance actually backed into the doorframe, her clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. Mrs. Patterson, the same woman who'd suggested Elia be more careful, suddenly found urgent need to examine something on her attendance sheet. The cowardice of willful blindness had limits, and those limits materialized in the form of a man whose reputation preceded him like a shockwave. Principal Crawford appeared as if summoned, his administrator's smile already in place before he'd fully processed the scene developing on his campus. He was a man in his 50s who'd perfected the art of managing parents through careful platitudes and strategic deferrals, a career built on maintaining peace through avoiding accountability. "Good morning. Welcome to Riverside. I don't believe we've had the pleasure." Crawford's greeting died when recognition hit. His face went through a fascinating progression of emotions: confusion, realization, fear, and finally the desperate calculation of someone trying to remember if he'd recently offended anyone who might warrant this particular visit. Naren reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness, giving everyone time to notice, to wonder, to consider possibilities both mundane and terrible. What emerged was a manila envelope, thick with contents that suggested documentation rather than threat. He held it out to Crawford with the air of someone delivering a subpoena. "This contains formal complaints about student harassment, documented incidents of physical assault, and records of every report Mrs. Halden filed that your staff chose to ignore." Niran's voice carried across the parking lot, ensuring everyone present heard every word. "Also included is a check for $50,000 designated specifically for your school's anti-bullying and student safety programs." Crawford took the envelope with shaking hands, his face now displaying the unique expression of someone who'd just been publicly backed into a corner of their own making. The donation was simultaneously a gift and an indictment, generosity that highlighted previous neglect. Refusing it would confirm everything Niran implied, while accepting it meant acknowledging the failures being corrected. "There's one more thing inside." Niran's tone dropped to conversational level, meant only for Crawford, though others strained to hear. "A list of every lawyer in Wilmington who specializes in negligence suits against educational institutions. Consider it informational, in case Mrs. Halden decides her daughter's documented suffering warrants legal remedy." The principal's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. His carefully maintained authority had been stripped away in minutes, replaced by the cold understanding that consequences he'd successfully avoided were now circling back with interest. The parents watching would talk, the school board would hear, and his comfortable pattern of minimum intervention had just become untenable. Aaliyah stood silent throughout this exchange, her hand still in Naran's, watching the adults around her scramble to respond to pressure they'd never felt necessary to apply on her behalf. She'd learned early that justice was selective, that protection flowed to those who already had power. Now that equation had reversed, and every person who dismissed her was being forced to recalculate. "I expect Aaliyah's experience at this school to improve dramatically." Niran's final statement wasn't a threat, because threats implied possibility of non-compliance. This was simply reality being dictated by someone with the power to ensure it manifested. "If it doesn't, I'll take a more personal interest in how this institution operates." 3 days passed before Seren found the courage to enter the restaurant. She'd walked past it twice, her feet carrying her to the corner before her nerve failed, and she continued to the bus stop instead. The building intimidated her with its polished glass and valet parking, a world she visited only as staff, never as guest. But gratitude had weight, and some debts demanded acknowledgement even when payment was impossible. Her daughter had slept through the night for the first time in weeks, had come home from school with a story about eating lunch in the cafeteria without anyone bothering her. That miracle deserved more than silence. The maitre d' intercepted her 2 steps past the entrance, his professional smile already forming words of polite rejection. She wore her nicest dress, the navy one she saved for parent-teacher conferences, but next to the other patrons in their evening finery, she might as well have been wearing uniform scrubs. "I need to speak with Mr. Calvert." The words came out firmer than she'd intended, powered by the same steel that got her through double shifts and eviction notices. "Please tell him Seren Halden is here." She met the man's eyes and refused to look away, refused to accept dismissal without at least trying. Something in her expression must have registered, because the maitre d' paused, reassessed, then nodded toward the bar. "Wait here." He disappeared through a doorway partially hidden behind an ornate mirror, leaving Seren to stand awkwardly near the entrance while well-dressed strangers pretended not to notice her. The restaurant's interior was beautiful, in a way that felt almost aggressive, crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than a year's rent, artwork she recognized from a museum field trip Aaliyah had taken in 1st grade, silverware that caught the light like small blades. This was where power dined while discussing how to acquire more of it. Naran appeared from the same hidden doorway, his presence shifting the room's energy in ways Seren couldn't fully articulate. Conversations continued but grew quieter, as if people instinctively lowered their voices when he was near. He approached her with measured steps, his face revealing nothing of what he might be thinking. Mrs. Halden. He acknowledged her with a slight nod, then gestured toward a quieter corner away from the bar's traffic. You didn't need to come here. It wasn't dismissal, just statement of fact delivered in that same neutral tone he'd used when speaking to Principal Crawford. Seren followed him to a small table near the windows where the Cape Fear River caught the last rays of sunset, turning the water into molten copper. Up close, she could see the details the distance at her apartment had obscured, the gray threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that suggested exhaustion hiding behind control, the way his expensive watch sat loose on his wrist as if he'd recently lost weight. I needed to thank you. For Aaliyah, the words felt inadequate, too small to carry the magnitude of what he'd done. She's been going to school without crying. That's not something I've been able to say in a month. Her voice cracked, despite her effort to keep it steady. Naran studied her face with the same intensity he'd given Elia's drawing, searching for something he seemed to find in the set of her jaw, or the shadows under her eyes. The school should have acted when you first reported the problem. You shouldn't have needed me. The criticism wasn't directed at her, but at the system that had forced this moment into existence. But they didn't, and you did. Seren pressed on, needing him to understand that his cynicism about institutions didn't diminish the reality of his impact. You have no idea what it's like to watch your child suffer, and have everyone tell you it's normal, that you're overreacting, that kids need to toughen up. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, anchoring her against the wave of emotion threatening to break through. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Outside, a yacht moved slowly downriver, its lights beginning to glow as evening descended. Naran watched it pass before speaking again, his voice lower than before, almost gentle. I know what it's like to be powerless, to scream for help in a world that's chosen not to hear you. Seren saw something shift in his expression, a crack in the facade that revealed the human underneath the reputation. This wasn't the monster Wilmington whispered about in bars and boardrooms. This was someone who understood suffering from the inside, who'd built walls so high people mistook them for the entirety of who he was. Why did you help her? Really? Because nobody else would. The answer came immediately, as if he'd been waiting for someone to ask the question directly. And because at some point, power has to mean something beyond acquiring more of it. Otherwise, what's the point? He leaned back, the moment of vulnerability closing as quickly as it had opened. The package arrived at the district attorney's office on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier service with no return address. Inside the unmarked manila folder lay evidence compiled with the precision of someone who understood exactly how the legal system operated and what documentation it required to move from willful ignorance to mandatory action. Photographs showed the black Dodge Charger parked outside Riverside Elementary on 14 different dates, time-stamped and geotagged. Security footage from nearby businesses captured the same vehicle following Aaliyah's walking route home, maintaining distance but present in frame after frame like a predator tracking prey. The technical quality suggested professional surveillance equipment, not cell phone cameras. Bank records traced the Charger's registration to a shell company that collapsed under minimal investigation, revealing connections to the Westside Cruise financial network. Phone records showed calls between the vehicle's registered user and 3 members of the organization currently under federal investigation for racketeering. Someone had done the work prosecutors usually couldn't afford to prioritize. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Finch spread the contents across her desk, her coffee growing cold as she absorbed the implications. She'd worked gang cases for 6 years, knew the West Side Cruise patterns, understood how they operated in spaces law enforcement rarely bothered to look, but this level of detail suggested access to resources that made her departmental budget look like pocket change. The evidence didn't stop at the car. Included were sworn affidavits from 4 other families in Eliah's neighborhood, describing similar harassment patterns. Children followed, parents threatened, all within the same 3-block radius. Each statement had been notarized. Each family offered contact information, their fear apparently overcome by whatever assurance had convinced them to speak publicly. Medical records documented Aaliyah's injuries with clinical precision. Emergency room visits explained away as accidents now formed a pattern unmistakable in its consistency. Dr. Yolanda French from Cape Fear Valley had attached a personal note stating she'd reported suspected abuse to authorities twice, with copies of those reports showing they'd been filed but never investigated. The final section detailed the school's failure to act despite documented complaints. Email chains between Seren and Principal Crawford showed increasingly desperate pleas met with bureaucratic deflection. A recording of her conversation with the vice principal captured the exact moment she'd been told that children exaggerate, and perhaps family counseling would help address Aaliyah's behavioral concerns. Finch reached for her phone, dialing the police captain who handled organized crime cases. "We need to talk about the West Side crew and a protection racket targeting single mothers on the East Side. And before you tell me we don't have resources for this, I'm looking at enough evidence to bury them." Her voice carried the edge of someone who'd watched justice fail too often and was done making excuses. By Thursday, 3 members of the West Side crew sat in interrogation rooms, their lawyers already negotiating deals in exchange for testimony against higher-ranking members. The organization's protection racket unraveled with surprising speed once prosecutors applied actual pressure, revealing a network that had operated openly for months because nobody with power had bothered to look. Friday's newspaper carried the headline, "District Attorney Announces Major Gang Bust, Following Tips About Child Endangerment." The article detailed arrests, pending charges, and the DA's promise to investigate why earlier complaints had been ignored. Finch gave interviews speaking about systemic failures and renewed commitment to protecting vulnerable populations. Nobody mentioned the anonymous evidence delivery. Nobody questioned why gang members' phones had been tapped without official warrants, or how surveillance footage had been obtained from businesses that hadn't willingly cooperated with police requests in years. The investigation's origins remained deliberately vague, a gift horse whose mouth nobody wanted to examine too closely. Serene read the article 3 times, sitting at her kitchen table while morning light slanted through the window. Elia ate cereal across from her, swinging her legs in a way she hadn't done in weeks, the constant tension finally beginning to leave her small body. The black car wouldn't be coming back, and somehow they both knew it. That evening, Serene left work early for the first time in months, using personal time she'd been hoarding for emergencies. She walked to the restaurant by the river, not to go inside, but simply to stand across the street and watch lights glow in the windows, where people who'd never known fear like hers enjoyed their evening meals. Gratitude didn't require acknowledgement, just the quiet recognition that some debts could never be repaid, only honored through living the life someone had made possible. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Wilmington look like a postcard. Elia walked to school with her mother for the first time since the nightmare began, their hands linked. Serene's shift schedule miraculously adjusted after a conversation with her supervisor that she still didn't fully understand. The hospital's administrative wheels didn't usually turn in favor of single mothers, but apparently they had this time. The school grounds had transformed in subtle ways that only someone who'd experienced the before could truly appreciate. Teachers stood visible at designated monitoring posts during arrival and dismissal, their presence no longer decorative but functional. A new security protocol required all vehicles to display identification, with unauthorized cars reported immediately to administration. Travis Sheridan attended classes now from a different section, his schedule rearranged so his path never crossed Elia's. His father had withdrawn from the school board citing personal commitments, though rumors suggested Principal Crawford had made remaining untenable through conversations about liability and institutional reputation. Money still talked, but apparently it had learned to speak in Aaliyah's favor. The girl who'd once eaten lunch hiding in the library now sat at a table near the windows with 2 other children who'd been quietly reassigned to her class. They weren't friends yet, but proximity without threat was its own kind of miracle. She laughed at something one of them said, the sound carrying across the cafeteria like proof of concept. Mrs. Patterson had been transferred to administrative duties, her classroom teaching responsibilities reassigned pending review of her student supervision practices. The official explanation cited workflow optimization, but everyone understood the real message. Failure to protect children now carried consequences, even for teachers who'd grown comfortable with selective blindness. Naren watched from his car parked a block away, positioned where he could see the school entrance without being obvious about it. He'd been coming each morning for 2 weeks, a routine he couldn't quite justify, but also couldn't seem to break. Cole had stopped asking why, simply accepted that this stretch of surveillance had become part of their daily pattern. Elia emerged from the building at dismissal with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, moving with the lightness of someone who'd been released from invisible chains. She paused at the gate, scanning the street with practiced caution. Then her face broke into a smile that transformed her completely. Not because she saw him, she didn't, but because she saw her mother waiting, and that was enough. Serene waved, and Elia ran to her with the unself-conscious joy of a child who'd remembered what safety felt like. They walked together toward the bus stop, Serene's hand resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder, their conversation animated enough to generate hand gestures, and shared laughter. Niran started his engine, preparing to leave before they might notice his presence. He'd done what needed doing, achieved the outcome that mattered. His continued observation served no purpose beyond the strange satisfaction of witnessing the peace he'd helped create, proof that power could build instead of destroy. But before he could pull away, Elia turned back toward the street as if sensing something. Her eyes found his car with eerie precision, recognition dawning across her features. She raised one small hand in a wave that held more eloquence than words could manage. Gratitude, acknowledgement, and the simple goodbye of someone who understood that protection didn't require constant proximity. Niran lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel in response, the gesture minimal but unmistakable. Their eyes held across the distance for 3 seconds, that somehow contained the entire journey from her terrified entrance into his restaurant to this moment of her reclaimed childhood. Then she turned back to her mother, and the world continued forward. He drove away slowly, watching them shrink in his rearview mirror until they disappeared around a corner. The hollowness that usually filled his chest had been replaced by something he couldn't quite name, something that felt dangerously close to contentment, purpose maybe, or simply the rare experience of using what he'd built for something that wouldn't haunt him. The Cape Fear River reflected afternoon sun as he crossed the bridge back toward the restaurant, the water sparkling with the kind of beauty that existed regardless of what happened in the streets around it. Wilmington would continue being Wilmington, corrupt and elegant, dangerous and charming. But in one small corner of it, a 7-year-old girl could walk to school without fear, and that shifted the equation in ways statistics would never measure. Seren discovered the envelope 3 days later, tucked beneath a water glass at the corner table where Niran usually sat during his late dinners. She'd come to the restaurant on impulse after her shift, driven by the need to see him one more time, to put words to the transformation he'd created in their lives. The maitre d' had seated her with quiet courtesy that suggested instructions had been left regarding her welcome. But Niran wasn't there. The table sat empty, perfectly set for a guest who wouldn't arrive. She'd waited 20 minutes, ordering coffee she couldn't afford, before noticing the cream-colored envelope with her name written in precise handwriting that suggested fountain pen rather than ballpoint. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside lay a silver chain, so delicate it seemed made of captured moonlight, the metal cool against her palm. The pendant attached was a small star, 5 points perfectly symmetrical, catching the restaurant's amber lighting and throwing it back in tiny prisms. No jeweler's mark indicated its value, but the weight suggested real silver, perhaps more precious metal than she'd ever owned. The note accompanying it was brief, written in the same precise hand as the envelope. Now the world believes her. It's all that mattered. No signature, no explanation beyond those 9 words that somehow contained everything that needed saying. Belief, the foundation of safety, the currency that had been denied until he'd forced its exchange. Seren read the words 3 times, each pass revealing new layers. He'd given Elia back her credibility, restored the social contract that said children's fears deserved adult attention. The physical gifts, the school intervention, the legal evidence, the systematic dismantling of threats, all served that single purpose, making the world believe a 7-year-old girl when she said she was in danger. She fastened the chain around her neck with shaking hands, the star settling against her collarbone like a talisman. Through the restaurant's windows, the Cape Fear River moved in its eternal rhythm, indifferent to human drama playing out along its banks. Somewhere in this city, a man who terrified hardened criminals had decided that one child's nightmare mattered more than maintaining his careful distance from consequences. The waiter appeared with a fresh coffee she hadn't ordered, setting it down with a small nod toward the window. He wanted you to know he appreciated your visit. The message came delivered in neutral tones that revealed nothing about when or how those instructions had been communicated. Niran was already gone, had probably never planned to be here tonight, but he'd anticipated her arrival with the same precision he applied to everything. Seren touched the star pendant, feeling its edges press against her skin. This wasn't just jewelry. It was a promise kept, evidence that someone powerful had looked at her daughter and seen a person worth protecting, rather than a problem to ignore. The gift's value had nothing to do with its materials, and everything to do with what it represented. She finished her coffee slowly, savoring the moment and the quiet elegance of the space around her. People at other tables conducted their business dinners and romantic evenings, oblivious to the fact that someone had recently sat in this very spot and decided to weaponize his influence for mercy instead of profit. The world continued its rotation, But in one small orbit, everything had fundamentally changed. Outside, Wilmington's evening unfolded in familiar patterns. Tourists wandered the Riverwalk taking photographs of historic buildings. Business owners locked their shops and headed home to families. Somewhere, the West Side Crew's remaining members scrambled to rebuild what prosecution had dismantled, learning too late that some territories weren't worth the cost of entry. And in a small apartment on 5th Street, Elia slept through the night without nightmares, her breathing deep and peaceful. The bruises had faded from her wrist, the fear had begun to leave her eyes, and tomorrow she'd wake up in a world that had finally aligned itself in her favor. Not because systems had suddenly started working, but because one person with power had chosen to deploy it on behalf of someone with none. Seren left the restaurant with the pendant warm against her skin, carrying proof that the world could shift when the right pressure was applied to the right points. She'd thank him again if their paths crossed, but suspected they wouldn't. Men like Naren Calvet operated best from shadows, their impacts felt rather than observed. The gift was both gratitude and goodbye, acknowledgement and closure wrapped in silver and good intentions. The river reflected city lights as she crossed the bridge toward home, each ripple carrying illumination before releasing it to darkness and accepting the next. Life would continue its complicated dance between power and vulnerability, cruelty and protection. But tonight, one mother walked home knowing her daughter was safe, and one man sat somewhere in the city understanding that his empire had finally been used for something that mattered beyond its own expansion. In the space between those two truths, something like redemption had taken root and quietly begun to grow. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you more stories like Aaliyah and Naren's. Did this story change how you think about power and protection? Let me know below.